I wonder how many people see through the rhetoric of totalitarian liberalism and recognize what is being done to them. The country is moving toward fascism, with ever more power being consigned to the omnipresent, paternalistic, later to be omnipotent state. That was his reply when he was confronted with the difference between rape fantasies and actual rape. We've seen all these other evasions before, but now he is in effect saying, well, if you think what he endorses is bad, just take a look at how totalitarian life in the modern 1990s United States of America is. Mind-blowing. And I don't think he's putting on an act. I think he believes this. I think he's deeply committed to the role he's playing and to the philosophy and political position that he is propounding. The interviewer presses further here. Of course, a rape fantasy cannot harm a woman, whereas a rapist can. Reading about being a slave is a lot more intriguing than actually being a slave. So again, can we press the author? Can we press John Norman to recognize these are two very different things? We're no longer talking about dress-up playtime. We're talking about his stated political ideology, his philosophy on actual abduction, kidnapping, and enslavement. Norman replies, perhaps, but within the privacy of their own relationships, many women do live and love the life of a female slave. No, they don't. No, they don't, John. Those women you're talking about, they read books. They have jobs, right? They have a whole life outside of the life of a slave in a slave society. Have you read even one book about what slavery was like in the United States of America just a couple hundred years ago? No, they don't. Some people, and it's not even a very large percentage of people. Let's be honest. The number of people who enjoy pretending to be a slave, it's a pretty small minority. But there's a small minority of people who like pretending that for how many hours a day? Is it even 2 hours a day? All right, this is way less popular than video games. Let's face it. People would rather pretend to be the Super Mario Brothers. I mean, this is really not that common a pastime. But the people who do that as a pastime, they still care about their liberty. They still care about their political autonomy. They still care about democracy, about having the right to vote or write a letter to Parliament. They still care about whatever, ecology, animal rights, whatever the issues are they care about. All right? No, it is not the case that any percentage of women, not even 1%, not even 0.5%, actually want to be slaves in the sense of losing those liberties, which, let's face it, also includes loss of access to education from childhood forward. I just mentioned really briefly, I value the fact that I used to live in a society where I was surrounded by people who had zero formal education. When I lived in Laos and Cambodia, at that time, there still were people who had never been to school, had never been to a classroom at all, not even grade 1. And you got to see how human intelligence develops in the total absence of literacy, total absence of formal education. And people can still be smart and they can still be clever. But, they cannot read the warnings on a can of beans or something. They can't read a cigarette packet. They can't read labels. Their place in society in the 21st century is really quite tragic, being illiterate. No, John. It's not anyone's fantasy to be a powerless slave. There's more than one unspoken problem here that's ripe and ready for critique. If you have a slave society like that of Gore, you don't just have enslaved women, you also have enslaved men. The interviewer asks, in your books, men regard slavery as a fate worse than death. The women, on the other hand, fight slavery, but come to understand that it is their highest state. I cannot remember if anyone in your book, Hunters of Gore, says, kiss the whip. But the sentiment, which is echoed frequently in the later novels, aptly expresses the breakthrough moment for the women you depict. Doesn't that express violence against women? The authors reply, the issue is not violence, but dominance and strength. Many women respond to strength and force. They like it. They want it. Most women want a man capable of mastering them. I ask simply, if that is not an evasion of the ethical, philosophical, and political point. What is? The interviewer continues, as in romance novels, Norman, the genre is referred to as bodice rippers. At a fiction writers convention a few years ago, I attended a panel on romances. One woman author recounted a criticism she had received from her editrix to the effect that the hero had not raped the heroine. That was supposedly something to be corrected. Why? The interviewer just asks, why? But look what Norman jumps to say in response. Quote, I frankly suspect that the matter is biological, and this does lie somewhere within all women. One supposes that there is a man in a situation in which any woman could be mastered and would respond as a loving slave. Our intrepid interviewer, David A. Smith, does not let him off the hook that easily. Quote, there is a large difference between power romances, where the heroine succumbs willingly to the hero's greater strength, and the rape romances, where the heroine has to be enslaved and bludgeoned into submitting, only to be liberated later on. While you may take issue with the word rape, your heroes put women in chains, brand them, starve them, and use force to make them succumb to sex. That the women come to enjoy or even to crave their submission does not change the fact that force was used to obtain it in the first place. I am sure that many women who want to swoon for Mr. Heathcliff or Mr. Rochester would draw the line at using force to procure sex. And here is the ever so disappointing reply from John Norman. When confronted on this fundamental problem, not just with his fiction, but with his deadpan serious philosophical and political claims. Quote, there is very little bludgeoning in the Gorian books. Women slaves are mastered, but there seems to be a little physical abuse involved. There seems to be little physical abuse involved. There seems to be little violence. You would think we were talking to someone here who hadn't read the books, and we're talking to the guy who wrote them. All right? There's little violence compared to what? Have you ever heard of a series of books that had more violence against women, that had more rape, that had more abduction, kidnapping, sexual slavery? We continue. There is, of course, the actual control of food and the threat of the whip. That would be normal in a barbarian society. And I remind you, this is being said by someone who presents this vision of the future for our own society as the best possible world given human nature. It's quite a claim he made there. It's quite a claim that there's very little bludgeoning. It's like, well, people are whipped and starved and branded and abducted and raped. Oh, yeah. But there's very little bludgeoning. So what? John Norman draws the line at bludgeoning and therefore thinks he's presenting us with some kind of utopia and some kind of model for a better political society. A better society than our own in the 21st century that he reviles in a lot of verbiage he's borrowed from Ayn Rand. He reviles as being some kind of terrible totalitarian dystopia. From the perspective of a slave, I think any slave living in his parallel universe of Gore would regard our society right here, right now as a utopia, including the fact that we have access to running water, electricity, and free government-provided education, upward mobility, employment that goes beyond mere slavery. Quote, so in this book, Tarl sets out for the north, and on the way gains the trust of a group of Viking raiders with acts of heroism and one-liners. The Vikings from Torvald's land ransack a temple of the priest kings and take quite a bit of gold along with the choice women of the surrounding town. This is where the story gets really kinky for about 60 pages straight, during which Tarl takes a break from his quest and enjoys a little erotic vacation in Torvald's land, while we get to learn firsthand about breaking in slave girls. Yep. Initially, I found Ivar Forkbeard, Jarl of the Viking Rogues, to be a pretty interesting character, up until he began whipping women and repeating mantras like, a brand improves a woman, while laughing continuously. Then I felt like he was a psychopath, and not a funny, ha-ha psychopath as you often see in pulp novels. Only a few days of indoctrination wholly transforms the slave girls into giddy sex maniacs, completely dedicated to the service of their master and any other free man around who has the consent to bang them. let's be clear, that would be consent from the slave owners, not consent from the slave. There are so many things outrageously, obviously wrong with John Norman's philosophy of a better future built on rape and sex slavery. Even if you can construe, as John Norman tries to, that a particular woman may love a particular man enough to be enthralled by him, shall we say, enough to act out some kind of master-slave dynamic in their relationship, there is no argument for why buying and selling women in a slave market, which happens in these books all the time, there's no argument for why women being kidnapped and abducted by force, as just happened in this description and happens in these books all the time, there's no reason why men sharing these women, sometimes on the basis of prostitution that happens in the books, sometimes on the basis of them playing kinds of games or sports where the winner gets to rape the woman and so on. What's actually described and put forward for the reader's delectation as satisfying and necessary given human nature, it would be impossible to imagine this being anything less than traumatizing and horrible for the women involved. I don't know, even using your imagination in the most liberal way possible to imagine the most kinky, BDSM-obsessed women possible. But to reorganize all of society on this basis, to imagine and insist, as John Norman does, that this is something innate to womankind and universal in human nature, and that women feel this way regardless of who the man is, regardless of which man it is that happens to dominate them, use them, and abuse them in this way. That is truly mind-blowing. I mean, I'm sure, by the same token, he couldn't imagine that he himself would feel the same way about all women. He wouldn't feel attracted to all women, even just talking about it physically, let alone mentally. He does, by the way, constantly share with us his judgments about what is and isn't an attractive woman, and how he feels the modern decadent West has slid away from an appreciation of true beauty. All of his personal sexual predilections he regards as scientific facts. They're either scientific facts under the heading of psychology or under the heading of biology. Only very rarely is he put into a corner where he has to claim they're facts under the heading of philosophy. It seems to be an area he avoids as much as possible. But he thinks it's a biological fact that the women he finds attractive are really attractive, whereas what our decadent society puts on the cover of Cosmopolitan magazine, the women who in our modern Western society are considered attractive, that's somehow demented and bad and wrong, and reflects the extent to which we've all fallen away from the primordial and Stone Age perfection that he is trying in his way as a creative author to return us to. How dare you say, John Norman, that there's relatively little violence? How dare you say that there's nobody gets bludgeoned or nobody gets hurt? You have very explicitly described throughout your books precisely people being bludgeoned, precisely people being physically destroyed, physically hurt. What you leave unstated is what the emotional and psychological consequences would be for any particular people, and what the consequence would be if you actually scaled this up to look at a society of millions as a whole. Right? And the sad fact is, there's a whole, shelf full of books in the library that really can describe that for you. You can look at the history of slave societies. You can look at what life is like in societies, even where just there were really, really high levels of prostitution, and interviews with the prostitutes and what their lives are like when they look back on the decades they lost, sometimes being in outright captivity and sex slavery, sometimes more in a gray area and so on. It would actually be very easy for him to read about the real world implications of having a society that permits this kind of sex slavery domination. All right? And yes, I'm sorry to say, I think he would run into some ineluctable, impossible to obviate scientific facts that really do prove that he is in the wrong. And this is a man whose whole life was based on the conceit that he alone was writing science fiction, whereas the other authors in his category had no interest in science at all, because he alone, he felt, took the lessons of Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud and applied them scientifically to psychology. He had discovered the key to human nature. And you see now in this short video what it is he felt that he unlocked. Only a few days of indoctrination wholly transforms the slave girls into giddy sex maniacs, completely dedicated to the service of their master and any other free man around who has the consent of the master to bang them. Tarl takes quite a few girls to the furs, since there don't seem to be any couches around in the north. The slave girls end up thanking their captors for freeing them sexually through rape, if you can imagine that. John Norman's intense attention to detail was a bit too much in this third of Marauders of Gore, and ended up not being sexy whatsoever, just vile and ludicrous. I'd like to thank the author of that review for really taking the time to put some verve and panache into it. Many of the reviews instead read as follows, which are brief and to the point. I just draw your attention to the fact this guy gave it 3 stars. Many of the people who condemn these books harshly still see some value in them. But why does he have to go on and on about the same all women need to be dominated, they just don't know it yet scenario? Honestly, most of what he drones on about lasts for ages, it seems, and he puts it right in the middle of the action, as if the characters stop and rethink their whole lives every other minute. A female reviewer here who read this book because of the cover art, she's into belly dancing, and she thought this would be an interesting science fiction book about belly dancing. How wrong she was. The dialogue is atrocious. It's full of pointless conversations, such as, "Master, you are chained." "Slave, yes, master." "Master, you enjoy being chained." "Slave, yes, master, I am a slave." "Master, you enjoy being a slave." "Slave, yes, master." Followed by the slave begging for sex, although what she's all hot and bothered about remains to be seen. And this brings me to another point. Yes, this book is about women being slaves to men. I was not expecting it to be a feminist book. I could appreciate it if it was the fantasy, sexy fun I figured it would be. Instead, it's filled with pages full of Norman's own insistence that modern women are somehow denying their true femininity by not enslaving themselves to men. Norman constantly bashes feminism to the point that it pulls you right out of the fantasy at every turn. Slaves are constantly insisting that they love to be a slave, explaining that they were meant to be a slave, how they are now fully aware of their femaleness, and how badly Earth women are missing out on this slave paradise, etc. Instead of feeling like I'm taken to another world where things are different than on Earth, I feel like I'm reading a book that is the author's soapbox for his anti-feminist views and his sexual fantasyland, despite the fact that he conveniently skips describing the sex scenes and spends all his time detailing how the women are chained instead. In the book Hunters of Gore, after many encounters, most of which involve the victor staking out the vanquished naked on the ground, the men eventually conquer the women, whereupon a remarkable, to me, transformation occurs. All of the women, all of the Panther girls, except their leader, fling themselves joyfully upon their conquering men, ecstatic at becoming sexual and social slaves, delighted that in overcoming their pose of independence, their captors have genuinely freed them from themselves. This plotline is qualitatively different from the previous stories, where slavery and sexuality are present, but the main story is adventure. We've seen again and again how Norman replies when he's pressed on this issue, when he's really pressed on the point, this is violence, this is rape. And he's not going to disappoint us with his evasive and dishonest reply now. He takes the most cowardly route of all, again and again, of trying to represent himself as the victim here, as if the problem is that he has all his life been hounded and persecuted for political reasons by these feminists who see something objectionable in his work for no valid reason at all, when Anne Rice gets away with the same thing, blah, blah, blah. Here is John Norman's reply. Betty Ballantine objected to the book, Hunters of Gore. We had a signed contract, but the book was rejected without explanation. I heard nothing further for some time. Finally, I asked. Ian Ballantine, who was rather embarrassed with the whole matter, speculated that Betty's problem with the text was the fact that the book contained sexual matter as part of the rich background of a barbaric culture. The interviewer asked, so the problem was the sexual content? Norman's reply, I was told the problem was not sex. I inferred it must be political. John Norman is an inspiration, but not at all in the way he imagined himself to be. I knew professors who lived a bookish, dim, windowless existence at the University of Toronto, and for me, they were a negative role model. I looked at these men and thought, I don't want to end up like that. I want to actually go to Cambodia while I'm young and strong and can take some risks, and I want to go to northern Laos and walk around with the landmines, and if a landmine blows off my leg, so be it. I want to see the Mekong. I want to see these archaeological dig sites in their native habitat. I don't just want to see them in a museum in Europe. I want to actually go to Southeast Asia and have this experience. I want to do humanitarian work. I want to volunteer to work on a rice farm. I want to get my hands dirty. And I'm not going to be able to do it when I'm 65. It's got to be now. And I knew professors who lived their whole life back and forth between the library and the endless bureaucratic meetings that, define life for most career academics. I thought, I don't want to end up like you. There's a really strange sense in which you can look at the work and life of John Norman as this guy he had a PhD in philosophy. He became a career university professor. And he decided neither to rebel against that in the way I did and get out and actually start living the life that he really thought was worth living, nor did he rebel against it, within, the sphere of philosophy. He became passionately obsessed with promoting this philosophical and political view of the world that made sense to absolutely nobody but himself. He worked in this strange isolation where I think probably aside from this one interview, he probably never heard anyone say to him or suggest to him just how bad his writing was, just how fundamentally stupid and wrong his sense of mission and purpose in life really was. And he's remained devoted to it. He's never taken a step off that long and narrow path from 1966 to 2020. John Norman proves that you can't save the world alone. And he shows how dangerous it is to work in that kind of isolation where you're never challenged in your way of thinking, where you convince yourself that you're saving the world when in fact all you're doing is digging yourself ever deeper into a narrow pit of your own self-delusion, frankly, of your own narcissistic fantasies.
Make sure that you do me good, guys, because I come in here every single day covered in glitter, covered in sequins, covered in booty shorts, covered in nylons, so that I do not violate the terms of service, so that each and every one of you can have both hands on the keyboard, so that you can enjoy the stream, so you can have a good time listening to me, playing with me, singing with me, smiling with me, enjoying your life, which you do deserve to enjoy. Each and every moment of your life you enjoy, and each and every moment of your life is worthy. You guys, you can do it. You can be the best that you can be, and we can do it together. It's gonna take effort. It's going to take patience. It's going to take a lot of work. But if we don't try, then what the fuck is stopping us from just throwing ourselves off a bridge and giving up and saying, yeah, the planet is dying. The government hates us. The animals are leaving. The aliens aren't contacting us. We might be alone. It just might be you and me. But that's okay, because do you really need anyone else?